Welcome everybody to our little panel entitled Israel, Small Country, Big Ideas. I guess we'll start by introducing ourselves. Bruce, do you want to go first?
Sure. Bruce Tarragon, Blumberg Capital. First off, thank you. It's great to be here. I'm based in Silicon Valley. We're an early stage venture fund, and we've been investing in Israeli technology for about 30 some odd years at this point, and we actually have an office in Tel Aviv as well. But fundamentally, I would describe ourselves as a classic early stage venture fund, and we've been quite active. We're currently investing, finishing up out of our third fund, which is about a $150 million fund. Again, probably 75% seed investing. And we've been investing in probably one new company every month for the last bunch of years. We have probably about 70 companies across a number of different funds. And a big portion of our overall strategy historically and today has been Israel. Probably, again, there's no specific mandate within our fund, but probably 25 to maybe 35% of our fund has some nexus to Israeli technology. And, you know, fundamentally for us, probably some of you may know one of the patriarchs of venture capital, a gentleman by the name of Fred Adler out of New York. And they used to ask him, Fred, why are you investing in Israeli technology? And he said 3 reasons: brains, brains, brains. And I guess it's sort of like that thought about, you know, property, you know, real estate investing as well, you know, location, location, location. So, you know, we've just been, you know, incredibly amazed at the disruptive technologies that continue to come out of the Israel market. So Israel is just a part of our overall strategy. We're geographically agnostic. We have companies that are Canadian, we have US, Israeli, we have some Asian companies. We're really trying as fiduciaries to be focused on the best and the brightest entrepreneurs and the most disruptive technologies that we could find globally. And again, as I mentioned, we probably look at about 5,000 companies a year and invest in maybe 10 or 15 each year, so about one new investment a month. And we've really been thrilled by some of the great success. Some of you are clearly too young, as this young entrepreneur sitting in the front row, but some of you might remember a small company out of Israel called Teva Pharmaceutical, Checkpoint Software, DSP Group, EFI. These were some of the first investments we've made out of the Israeli marketplace that have been incredibly successful. And thankfully, we have a number that are today still relatively early, but quite promising as well. You know, namely companies like Creditrax and Double Verify and Zuz and Zeek, and a number of other companies. We're actually co-investors together in 2 companies, Mentat and BioCash, that are doing quite well, both in cybersecurity and digital media. And then again, we've been investing in technology in Silicon Valley. So one of the companies we seeded that was 3 founders, you know, with an idea just a few years ago was a company called Nutanix in the cloud computing space, and they're on track to do about $400 or $500 million in revenue this year in less than 5 years. They're valued in the billions, planning to go public, and we're up as an investor. We're up about 100 times our money. There was a small Canadian company called Hootsuite that some of you might be using here at South by in the social media space, and we were seed investors in that company, and they're currently at a valuation of about $1 billion, and we're up at about 50 or 60x our investment there, and a number of others. So it's really a privilege for me to be here. I'm excited to chat with everyone here and hopefully try to stay on message and answer any questions that might come up. And thank you for inviting me and hosting the panel, Zach.
Thanks, Bruce. I'm Zack Miller. I'm a partner at a much different entity, a company called OurCrowd. We're based in Jerusalem, and as you can tell by my accent, although I live in Jerusalem, I'm not originally from Israel. We are an equity crowdfunding platform. So what that means is that, similar to Bruce and his firm, we use an investment team that looks at and scouts out deals. We look at, you know, anywhere between 100 and 150 per month. That's a volume we're seeing right now. Last year we made over 40 investments. We have over 60 companies in our portfolio. We started in early 2013. We had our first exit last year. We invested in a company that actually got a lot of good PR out of Israel. That basically was a set of bionic legs. Maybe you've seen President Obama when he came to visit Israel. He met with the company, went public on the NASDAQ, a company called Rewalk, exactly. And our model is different. So because we don't have a fund, we're reliant upon the crowd essentially to make investments. Although we do our own due diligence and we put some of our own capital into each deal, about 5 to 10% of each investment, the rest of the check comes from the crowd. So in that sense, we are somewhat agnostic into the stage of the company, but we are focused on Israel. We're based in Israel. We have boots on ground in Israel. And we've invested over $100 million so far in the past 2 years. So it's been exciting for me. My background, although I've lived in Israel for the past 12 years, is more in public markets. It was my first sort of foray into private markets, and to me, the most exciting part of the Israeli economy is obviously the startups and the entrepreneurship that Bruce was just talking about. We're set to go global, although Israel is our home base, and we're going to continue to focus on Israel. We are expanding. I think 8 out of our last 15 investments were actually U.S.-based companies, but Israel it continues to be the core of what we do. How many, just to show of hands, I heard some Hebrew in the crowd. How many people have been to Israel? Okay, so preaching to the choir, I guess. But what we'd like to do is have a casual conversation today. Bruce and I are going to kind of talk about what we think makes Israel different and what we think makes Israel special. And hopefully, if there are questions that come along during it, definitely reach out and raise your hand. I'd like to make this as interactive as possible. So Bruce, one of the things they credit any type of startup, I remember as a kid learning that it takes a village to raise a child. It takes an ecosystem to raise a startup, and Bloomberg had a report maybe 3 weeks ago, I guess it was now, where Israel ranked in the top 5, top 6. There was a startup genome report in 2013. Israel ranked number 2, right behind Silicon Valley. Israel has what they call a very vibrant startup ecosystem, and that's comprised, of lots of different things: education, some government input, entrepreneurship, sort of a tolerance towards risk. Given the fact that you have a global fund, talk about the ecosystem a little bit. And you said brains. What about Israel is different?
Sure. So actually, it's interesting. We've looked at a few reports of late, and we as investors, just to step back a second from Zach's question, we as investors are focused on investing in technology the way we describe it, that comes out of these technology hubs of innovation. So actually, in that report, obviously Silicon Valley in the U.S. market, number 1, Israel, Berlin, Vancouver, have really been sort of the top, hubs right now, New York, for technology innovation. And those are not coincidentally the sectors where we've been most actively investing. So again, it gets to the earlier point, I think, that I touched on and Zach mentioned as well, that it's really about world domination, frankly, and finding entrepreneurs that can disrupt any given market. So whether they come from Vancouver, Tel Aviv, New York, or Silicon Valley, we want to see that opportunity and be investing in those companies. So that's what we've been focused in, as a fund. There's no doubt, Israel is incredibly differentiated and unique to be, number 1, number 2, number 3 in so many different metrics. When and many of you have been over there, so you can appreciate, geographically, how small, physically the country is smaller than the whole Bay Area. For some of you coming from the Bay Area, it's smaller than the state of New Jersey, and having a population of, 6-7 million people, it's really a tiny country. But I think it's really the culture. It's, the culture, the whole country was built on entrepreneurship fundamentally. So really it was
Other people call that chutzpah, but yeah.
Well, I think it's, that's the recipe for success. I think it's having some of that audacity and chutzpah, and then having a culture that, doesn't accept, status quo and is willing to challenge, what's, previously thought of as, not possible or inconceivable. And so what we've seen in Israel that's really unique to other regions, because, I was, a year or 2 ago in Portugal, been over to Japan, Korea, Saudi Arabia, really all over the globe, as a firm, my team and I, and Australia, and the question sort of comes up, it's like, well, and we've been invited to speak sometimes in some of these regions, and we're like, well, we don't really know anything about Australia, like, why do you want us to speak? And they're like, well, we want you to really talk about what you've done successfully out of the Israel market, and how maybe Australia or how Lisbon can replicate that model. And so it's again, to use your, vernacular, it's this cholent, it's this recipe of, having, at a very young age, it's having the top 1% of the country being recruited to work in these elite intelligence units like, the NSA, the CIA, et cetera. It's then the government throwing, many tens of millions of dollars at them in budget to sort of build something. And, it's not like here when you're a startup and, you're trying to create the next, Waze or the next Google, the next fantastic search engine. There, 3 or 4 engineers at a young age, at 18, that are drafted into the Army and there's mandatory service, they're basically told, hey, you better solve this problem or your grandmother's dead. And so that's a hell of a motivator, for these young entrepreneurs. And then the Army, unlike many other countries then, they come out and then they try to commercialize that technology and those products. And there's, again, a lot of that infrastructure and culture there. It's, the Office of the Chief Scientist, it's government support, funding that. So again, I don't think it's one specific ingredient necessarily that makes Israel unique. I think it's really the combination of many of those things, and it's a culture that, almost embraces failure and wouldn't describe not being successful as a startup as failure, but rather, oh, I've just learned so much and I'm going to take those learnings to the next company and the next company and the next company. We've already funded a team of entrepreneurs 3 times. We're on the 4th time out of Israel that we're funding them in less than 15 years. And literally to the day, like when their lockups are done with these big acquirers like IBM and Oracle and CA, they're like, okay, we're done here and we want to go do it again. And it's that type of initiative and passion that the entrepreneurs bring that's just amazing. And for sure across certain sectors, I think it's been much more cybersecurity, which again seems like a natural evolution coming out of the Army, or more enterprise B2B technologies, rather maybe, I don't know that you're necessarily going to see the next, Zynga or Groupon coming out of the Israel market. So I think there's been this amazing evolution. And then it's ultimately, it's venture capital. I mean, when my partner David Blumberg was investing with Fred Adler, I mentioned before, in the early 80s, none of the folks really existed. It was really in the early 90s to mid 90s, kind of post that Netscape IPO in like 1995, that Israel went from having $20 million in venture capital to having billions of dollars in venture capital. And Benchmark and Sequoia and Greylock and Excel and Battery are all opening up offices there and have some sort of presence and are really trying to pay attention. And I speak to my peers at again, these multi-billion-dollar funds that are coming over to Israel on regular trips to sort of source and scour the countryside, literally, and find the next great opportunity. So there really has been an evolution. It's taken a few decades. I mean, again, Israel was doing this in the early 80s, and it wasn't then what it is today. And so I think they're really well positioned, but they're being challenged by incredibly brilliant entrepreneurs coming out of India and China, and of course in the U.S. market as well. So I don't think Israel can necessarily, sit on the laurels of some of their successes and expect to just, continue to be the top performer. But when you look at, Intel, the 386, the 486 Pentium chips were all developed in Israel through multiple wars, and they didn't even miss one day of development. Motorola, Cisco, SAP, when, Google, Facebook, when you drive down, the highways, in Israel, you feel like you're on, the 101, in Silicon Valley, and all of the same signs are there. So, I think it's amazing that that ecosystem continues to flourish. And I would say the opportunity is there for us, being Israel, to screw up, basically. But I think they're really in a position where they can continue to really drive amazing innovation and be a market leader as they continue to have more successes.
Our founder, John Medved, used to kid around that if you remember the Intel Inside campaign, that really it should read Israel Inside, that most of the underlying technologies, whether it's your phone or your computer, much of that, as Bruce was saying, was developed in Israel at an early stage. I just want to segue into something that you talked about. So you said Israel was different in the sense that you do have this milieu of lots of different things going on. But yes, there are other hotbeds of technology as well. Can you, given the fact that your firm invests globally, can you talk a little bit, and you sort of touched on this already, about the Israeli entrepreneur? You said Israel has some focus on cybersecurity, although we don't call ad tech anymore. Israel is good at that. But what about the individual starting this company? Can you talk a little bit about how that person may be different than an entrepreneur you would find in Asia or in the US? Or?
Yeah, and maybe at a high level, I'm curious, how many of you are entrepreneurs here in the audience and starting your own companies? And we've typically seen sort of this valuation, differentiation across some of these different countries and different regions. Obviously Silicon Valley today is reasonably frothy, and valuations have definitely, they ebb and flow across, globally. But I would say Silicon Valley, you tend to see the highest prices, if you will. Maybe New York after that, maybe Germany, behind that, Israel, as well, and I would probably put Canada as, lower priced than, I would say Germany and maybe Berlin and Vancouver are probably similar. Israel a little bit pricier, maybe more in sync typically with New York. So I think to us what's always been incredible is, well, there's a certain camaraderie, a certain esprit de corps that you have in the Israeli culture that, doesn't exist elsewhere. When, again, many of these entrepreneurs have basically been together in the army, serving their country for many years, working in these small teams, developing product. And so they just come out of that experience, and they don't want to work for Cisco or Motorola or Intel necessarily, but rather they want to work with their peer group and, again, launch that next great company. And I think what's challenging, and I see it sometimes in the Valley and in other regions, the metaphor I would use is sort of the estuary, where, the fresh water and the salt water meet. That's really the most fertile breeding ground, for the fish. And I think in Israel, it's having these multidisciplinary backgrounds where they naturally know each other, work together, and collaborate to build something great. It's oftentimes very hard, in Silicon Valley and other regions for some of those folks to get together, trust each other, and be co-founders and work together. We've had a number of times where we've talked with, 3 co-founders in Silicon Valley, and then after a month or two, they kind of fall apart. And I've almost never seen that in the Israel market, which isn't to say, of course, I'm sure it happens and stuff, but I think the fact that they've literally been to war together and
even their childhood friends many times.
Yeah, and they they're being selected when they're 13 years old into this unit, and so spending that follow-up time together. So I think that really is unique and differentiates Israel as a culture. And then again, culturally, there's not the same stigma that you typically see. I was over a few years back in Japan with a colleague, and I remember working and developing a relationship with one of the gentlemen there, and he had said to me over dinner, he was telling me how he started a company, and then basically he lost his friends and family, the money, and he literally moved away. And he said it was like a shame for the family, and I think that's evolving, and that's not necessarily, obviously, true across the board. But it was interesting to note, and again, culturally in Israel, it's so rare to find that type of reaction. It's very, very unusual. So I think that there really is this ecosystem, where, entrepreneurship can flourish. Where we become maybe a little bit more gun shy and reticent is we'll see 3 entrepreneurs in Israel coming out of, let's say, Checkpoint or VMware or Cisco, and then they're trying to build a consumer app. 3 brilliant entrepreneurs, but their product marketing and product development skill sets are not necessarily in line with the company that they're trying to build, which again, it doesn't mean they won't do an amazing job, but it's not that they have the 20 years sort of a history and a track record to be able to demonstrate performance. And so that to us raises a little bit of a yellow flag with some of the entrepreneurs that we've seen coming out of the Israel market.
So you touched on what my next question was going to be. Since we have a lot of entrepreneurs in the audience, can you talk about some of the challenges as an investor, maybe some cultural differences or chasms maybe that exist? Maybe that's too strong of a word, but working with Israeli entrepreneurs?
No, never had a challenge.
Well, you touched on one, which is the fact that you'll get people coming out of a company, with sort of hard technology skills and go launch a consumer app and sort of feeling just, that they can conquer any problem.
Yeah. That gets back to your comment, I guess, of the chutzpah, which is good. We like that, trying to push the envelope. I think Israeli entrepreneurs have gotten criticism of late around their willingness to continue to build, a Nokia, another Checkpoint, a Teva Pharmaceutical. You're seeing a lot of the Israeli entrepreneurs to this point in time, kind of in that sub $250 million bracket, selling out maybe a little bit too early. There's obviously, even in the last year, there's been a handful of very impressive multi-billion-dollar IPOs and some great successes, and I'm incredibly sanguine that that's what the future is going to hold. So I don't, to my mind, it doesn't faze me at all, and I get it, and we probably on a percentage basis have similar amount of entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, and this is one of our challenges as a seed investor is we'll put in $2 million into a company, and then they'll get acquired for $25 million by a Facebook or a Zynga or whomever, or it could be $50 million, and for those entrepreneurs, that could be a life-changing event, but for us as a fund, it's not necessarily what, we signed up to do. And so I think that's probably been the biggest criticism that I think we've heard in the marketplace over the last few years of the Israeli entrepreneurs. And some of the bigger funds and some of my peers out in Silicon Valley have paused a little bit, if you will. Again, my sense is that the entrepreneurs in Israel are now, again, as I mentioned before, on their second, third, fourth company. They're not looking to have the quick flip and make a couple of $1 million. Many of these entrepreneurs, I mean, if you know Uri Levin from Waze, the founder of Waze, he had multiple offers and could have sold out a lot earlier. And in fact, to his credit, he turned down Facebook because they wanted to move R&D out to
$900 million too, right?
Exactly. I mean, it's not easy to turn down $900 million, but he got like 1.2 from Google, and and we're investors in a few of his new companies, and so we've spent a lot of time together, and he had tremendous principle that he didn't want to move R&D as Facebook had initially wanted, and pressured him for $900 million to move it out to the Bay Area, and two, he really wanted to build something that was much more substantial, and so I think we're going to continue to see that, and to the extent some of my colleagues don't feel that way, then it's great, because to me that's opportunity.
So I'm not going to let this one go a little bit. Again, the specific challenges, I mean, something that I think we feel, just a basic example, this is not that extraordinary, but we see deals from all over the world, as you guys do, and typically even the slide share that we get from US entrepreneurs, it just feels like there was so much more attention and effort put into it in terms of crystallizing the ideas, communicating the ideas, and I think sometimes the Israeli philosophy of sort of just get a MVP out, get it up, let's see how it works. There's a little corner cutting.
Yeah.
Do you sense that at all?
Yeah, I don't know. I might have felt that more 5 or 10 years ago, but even 15 years ago, and I've been with Blumber Capital now for almost 20 years on the investment side. Of late, I really don't have that sentiment. I think, again, what we've seen a little bit of over the last 5 or 10 years from the Israeli, community, and again, it's really at a macro level, and of course, there's so many exceptions. I would say it's really more the Israeli entrepreneurs that maybe had a lot of experience on the B2B side, and now they're doing something on the B2C side, and that would give us pause, and we're kind of like, well, why are you doing that? Like, you know what I mean? Like, stick with what you know. You know what I mean? Focus. And so, we tend to see a little bit more of that, I would say, from Israel than we've seen, maybe out of the U.S. Again, just one of the amazing benefits of Israeli entrepreneurship is the R&D costs in Israel. So they tend to be able to build companies with a lot less capital and truly be a lot more capital efficient. So, as a seed investor, and we mostly do seed Series A investing, I would say that, the seed rounds tend to be smaller, from the Israel market than some of the Silicon Valley seed rounds. But I think that's natural and it makes sense. And again, they can probably do a lot more for a lot less. Probably a third shift, I would say, is really just more procedural. Again, I don't know for how many of you that started companies, if you're setting up a U.S. versus an Israeli entity, whether it's an LTD or an Inc., the LTD being the Israeli entity and the Inc., being the U.S. entity. And, probably 20 years ago, they were almost all U.S. companies. And that shift has really gone the other way now, I think, with, to the credit of the Israeli government, trying to be much more entrepreneur-friendly, that there's not as much, in fact, there could even be benefits being an LTD with a wholly owned sub Inc. as opposed to being the U.S. Inc. with a wholly owned LTD sub. From a tax perspective, there's issues in terms of taking the IP, the intellectual property out of the country, things like that. So I think that that's been a pretty, big shift. But overall, I would say that, to my mind, and again, looking at it, like, if I contrast to, Berlin, Vancouver, like, for example, your comment about, maybe the slide deck, I would definitely say is true in Portugal. They're probably, to my mind, when I've been over there, it's felt like, it's kind of 1992. You know what I mean? Like, there's still some of that maturation, to go. And what's nice is I think there's really, they have a lot of the right ingredients. So I'm actually, again, bullish on what they're going to hopefully do over the next 10 or 15 years. Part of it also, and we didn't mention this before, but probably one of the most unique benefits that Israel has, which of course is in Silicon Valley, but not in Portugal and in, really very much, let's say, in Canada and some of these other regions yet, it's successful entrepreneurs. It's a Shlomo Kramer from Checkpoint actively investing, he's worth $1 billion and he's investing tens of millions of dollars back into other startups. I think we're co-investors on 3 or 4 companies with him. And so you really have in Israel now this prolific ecosystem of entrepreneurship where many of those entrepreneurs are giving back not just dollars, which is amazing, but also as advisors, board members, and and then again
You have this whole expat community too, right? That's also come and
For
work
sure.
in the U.S. and come back and contribute.
For sure, so there's a lot more of that as
Yeah.
well, but even just the local community that could understand and appreciate, that served in the same elite intelligence units, and maybe there's, some sort of cultural, special handshake that even after 20 years I still don't know, that these folks are just really tapped into and give back. That's really unique. I mean, that's not gonna happen overnight. I mean, that takes many decades. I mean, again, we were early investors in Checkpoint back in like 1994. Here we are in 2015. And, we're still running into, the founders, Gil, Shlomo, Marius, and they're doing, some of that angel investing, some of that maybe acquiring, and, and then, I mean, heck, Shlomo started in Perva and took another company public. And, I mean, it's amazing that, it's like, well, what more do you have to do? And, these entrepreneurs, Uri Levin, from Waze, I think we've seeded like 6 companies together that he's either a chairman of the board on and an angel investor in. And, that level of engagement is priceless, I think, for the entrepreneurial community. And it's, of course, incredibly vibrant in Silicon Valley, and we have so many friends that are, coming out of Apple and Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn, and, I mean, look at the PayPal sort of mafia. I mean, we've invested in a handful of ex-PayPal, Palantir founders, but it's like the gift that keeps on giving. So I think that is something that you just can't replicate, overnight in another country, and it's something that Israel has that's taken many decades to get to this point. And that's why, yet again, I'm going to be, incredibly bullish on, we're going to see, $50 billion outcomes, coming out of the Israel market, over the next 5 or 10 years. A number of them that are going to be 10 to 100 billion. They're not going to just be, 100 million or even $1 billion outcomes, because these entrepreneurs really want to continue to build. And obviously, again, a big shift in the marketplace. This is at a macro level, not just Israel, but globally has been, companies staying private a lot longer. People forget, but it's like, everyone looks at like the Facebook IPO and says, oh, what a failure. It went public for 50 billion or something like that, and obviously it's gone back up. It was targeting 100 billion. I mean, think about like Microsoft. Microsoft went public for less than $1 billion, just a few decades ago. And so probably 95 or even 99% of the wealth creation in a company like Microsoft, was realized by all of us as individuals investing in the public markets. Today, you have a Palantir at $10 billion. You know what I mean? Like, so many companies are staying private so much longer, and so the ecosystem has really changed. The trend has changed in that regard. And so I think you will see some of these companies go out for many tens of billions of dollars. I mean, look at like an Uber. I mean, I used 2 of them today. I mean, it's just amazing, and I'm staying in an Airbnb, and it's just collaborative consumption didn't exist, 15 years ago, and look how it's changed this whole ecosystem as we sit here today. So I think we're still in very nascent stages of innovation. We're seeing now this trend of machine learning, algorithmic technologies that are being infused into many mundane, esoteric types of business. It's an amazing time to be an entrepreneur. 10, 15, 20 years ago, you needed, to build all your, buy your servers and have your, all this technology for your data center. Now you can, you're up and running for $20,000 with Amazon rack space, whatever it might be, and incredible inefficiency now in the marketplace. So you're seeing this democratization of entrepreneurship on a global scale. So where we sit, it's and again, 15 years ago we probably looked at 500 companies a year and we invested in 5, and today we look at probably 5,000 and we invest in 10 or maybe 15. So the scale, it's just orders of magnitude.
Any questions up until now? Crickets. Yeah.
I have a question.
Please.
You said that Israel shouldn't sit on its laurels, and there's entrepreneurship and innovation coming from many other areas around the world. What would it take for Israel to keep being synonymous with innovation? What would be the key ingredients? What would you advise?
Well, I mean, for example, like the U.S. has tried to push a lot of initiatives to have more, teens and more kids through schooling going into engineering categories. I think there's something like, there's probably about 60 or 70,000 engineers that are graduating in North America a year, and there's demand for about 120,000 jobs annually. So that phenomenon, that shortage is actually causing a lot of these acqui-hires, where companies are just buying up, the Apples, the Facebooks, the Twitters, the Googles of the world are gonna buy a company just to have 25 great engineers, on their team, and they'll pay maybe $1, $2, $3 million a head sometimes for these companies. And literally, they'll shut down the technology. They're not buying it for the technology. They're literally buying it for the engineering resource. So I think in Israel, the percentage of folks that are graduating with an engineering background and degree needs to stay what it has been and not somehow shift maybe into sales, marketing, business development, or other types of majors and stuff that can always happen. So I think that needs to stay on track. Clearly, there needs to be that ecosystem. It's not just the great entrepreneurs. It's a Bank Leumi, it's a Bank Hapoalim, being willing to test, technology early, be those early adopters of technology. There needs to be an ecosystem of venture capital and angel investors. You need the Shlomo Kramers, the Uri Levins, and, the VCs, and the venture capital ecosystem in Israel has really been gone through, I think, a serious, sort of shakeup over the last, 2 decades as well. So I think there needs to be, and there's been a lot of criticism, and the returns really haven't been there for most of the funds, coming out of the Israel market. There's been a lot of, and when I talk to like limited partners, LPs that invest in our funds, they're focused on absolute returns. They don't really care like, oh, but you're the best fund in Israel. They don't really give a crap. They're focused on who are the best funds in the world, and that's who we want to be investing in. So that's the benchmark. And so I think, the Israeli funds have gone through massive, consolidation and shift over the last 20 years. Again, probably, 1999, 2000, there may have been 1,500 to 2,000 venture funds, across the globe. And, it's really gone down to probably, 500-ish types of funds. And so I think the Israeli funds need to continue to really filter through a lot of the noise and invest in some of the best and brightest entrepreneurs. And I think it's kind of interesting if you look, again, 15, 20 years ago, there were no U.S. names, that were from a venture perspective, that were in the Israel market. And today it's really almost dominated by, Canaan, Sequoia, Benchmark, Battery, Bloomberg Capital. My partner in Israel would say we're number 1, but I would say we're, in the top 5, brands that are there. So I think it's important that some of the local Israeli funds, I love, for example, what OurCrowd has done for the ecosystem. It's really just a wake-up call for everyone of taking this crowdsourced platform, investing in a company a company a week, for what their model is, to really shake up that ecosystem and be innovative. You have an AngelList, you have, Kickstarter, some of those equivalents, to an OurCrowd, slightly different models, and there are many of them. So I think it's, I applaud, John and Zack for being entrepreneurs fundamentally and pivoting. Even our fund, we started out much more classical Series A, Series B, and, we've really evolved, pretty quickly into much more seed investing, and then some Series A, opportunistically. And like our current fund's 150, we could have raised $300 million. We turned it down. We want to stay focused. Like we tell our entrepreneurs, it's all about focus and where we feel we can differentiate ourselves as a fund and provide outsized returns. So I just think Israeli entrepreneurs need to think about that. They need to maintain their ties into the marketplace, because fundamentally there's no market in Israel. I consider Israel beta testing, for your products with all your friends, which is great. It's priceless to have, Shlomo go talk to Shmulik, around the corner and be able to test his product and get, immediate response to figure out what his MVP needs to be. His MVP being this minimum, viable product. So I think that needs to continue, but then you need to really think about when you're building that product, is this, compelling? Is this, something that's a must-have? And, one of the things we built out as a firm, I just came from running a panel at this thing called the CMO Club, and they rented this room, and they have, many dozens of chief marketing officers, CMOs that were there, and we brought in, half a dozen companies to sort of do speed pitches and present to the CMOs. And these are CMOs we've been working with for 10 or 15 years. Similarly, we have a council of CIOs, Chief Information Officers. And so we try to tee these companies up that come to us early in front of many of these CIOs and CMOs or security companies like CISOs, like we were seed investors in Cyvera. We brought them in front of 30 Chief Information Security Officers at the RSA conference in San Francisco. Their first customers came through that lunch meeting with a few dozen CISOs, and in 16 months from when we seeded them, they got bought by Palo Alto for over 200 million. We made like 20, 25 times our money. We actually didn't even want to sell, and it gets to maybe the earlier point. We felt this could be $1 billion company, and we didn't even want to sell, even though we made 20, 25 times our money in 16 months. It was like a 500+% IRR. But I got it. For the entrepreneurs, it was very life-changing and a massive win. And they referred us some of their friends, Fourth Scale and a few other companies we've subsequently invested in, and they're all 30 years old, so I'm sure they're going to be back and when their lockup's done, and hopefully we'll have another opportunity to invest in them again because they're amazing entrepreneurs. But I think it's important for Israeli entrepreneurship to not sit on their laurels and think like, have some, which I'm not saying they do, but I just think that it's important to, again, always be sort of proactive and attacking the marketplace and trying to, trust and verify before, it's opportunity cost. So before any of you run a company, you want to talk to prospective customers. I have an entrepreneur say to me, well, I haven't built a product, so I don't know if the customers want to buy it. I'm like, what does that mean? Like, you have to talk to prospective customers and partners and ask them, if we build this, would you buy it, and how much would you pay, and is this a nice to have, is this a must have, is this really something that's compelling and differentiated? So I think it's fundamentally it's doing more of the same, and hopefully, and again, I'm very bullish, hopefully it's entrepreneurs that are like, I'm not looking to sell my company now for $200 million, I want to make it a $20 billion outcome. And for us, that's very exciting, and that's where some of my peers on Sand Hill Road are a little bit more cynical and have done a lot of data analysis and said, hey, the entrepreneurs in Israel just don't seem to want to build bigger companies and stick around. And again, I think actually even in the last, look at January, for God's sakes. Just in the month of January, it was like $1 billion worth of M&A and IPO activity for the Israel market. So in 2015, and then look at 2014, was historic. So to my mind, it's clear and obvious, and I'm not trying to convince them otherwise, frankly, because I'm happy for them to sit on the beaches of Silicon Valley, and I'll go to Tel Aviv and Herzliya, which are lovely beaches as well, and meet with the entrepreneurs there and try and invest in some of those companies. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
I'd like to echo a couple things Bruce said. As the Israel brand is getting stronger, Israeli companies are having relatively, again, this is broad sweeping generalizations, an easier time recruiting money. And, again, that's going to push from the investment point of view, it's going to push our returns down. There are new players coming in. We're a new player. Literally, we can put a quality investment up on our website and raise $1.5 million in just a couple of days. And it's like, we built the thing, and we know the investors, and I run marketing there, and like we put it up, and it's just gone. And it's like there's just this voracious appetite for Israeli tech. Not all ideas, should get funded, and I think that's going to be an issue down the road. The second issue, I just want to sort of reiterate what Bruce said. Because Israel is a small ecosystem, right? You can relatively easily go as a startup and get some feedback from Bank Leumi or from OurCrowd, the water company, and even produce a few revenues there. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're repeatable and sustainable revenues. I think we see a lot of companies that get that initial kind of feedback, it's positive. It's their buddy Shmulik down the road who said, yes, we're in. But then when they go to the US market, they have a little bit harder of a time sort of convincing a CMO or whoever it may be to bite, Yeah. And for us, it's like deciphering whether that really is a scalable business and repeatable. And just because you've proven it in Israel doesn't mean necessarily can take it out. So that was just sort of a nuance I wanted to add.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of what we try to do then. It's getting access, to a CIO and a CMO and some of their lieutenants is really challenging, and then just it's an acceleration of that sales cycle, which I'm sure many of you know. It could be 6, 9, 12 months, sometimes more, that you're trying to get to market. So we had one of our Israeli companies. We hold quarterly sessions with our CIOs on a formal basis both on the East Coast and West Coast, and two of my colleagues are former CIOs. You know, one was the CIO at Merck, and the other was the CIO at Albertsons, now Safeway, and he was the CIO at Delta Dental and Dignity Health, and we run sessions with usually, you know, between 10 and 20 CIOs every quarter, you know, twice, one East Coast, one West Coast, and we brought Israeli companies in to present and, you know, sort of pitch the CIO council. And we've been doing this for like 10 years, and it's great. You know, the CIO loves hanging out with other CIOs. They love learning about different interesting new technology opportunities. And then the entrepreneurs love to truth seek and get the feedback of like, hey, you know, you need to put these types of bells and whistles into your product, or this is not compelling, or this is amazing, and, you know, here's why. And, you know, we just love to be a fly in the room kind of, you know, and get that feedback. And it really helps us pre-investment sometimes drive some of our decision process. And then post-investment, many of our CIOs like to join up as a board member, an advisory board member, design partners, you know, things of that nature. So it's just, again, it's this virtuous ecosystem that we all sit in, you know, whether it's Israel, Silicon Valley, and other areas. It's just, you know, a privilege to do what we do, and, you know, it's amazing. Question?
You focus a lot on the alliance between Israel and the United States and that kind of investor exchange between the two. But I'm curious to what extent on a global level that Israel plays with the investors that come from China or emerging markets like Brazil or India. Or what is the connection?
Can I hop on that one first? So,
Sure.
I mean, we built OurCrowd as an individual investor platform. So you have to be accredited. You have to meet certain, whether it's income or net worth hurdles. But we have active investors from over 30 countries, right? We knew the US would be big. We knew South Africa would be big, Australia would be big, UK would be big. But who would have guessed Bulgaria would be big? And we didn't, there was this untapped demand. And part of it's, I think, in some of those countries, you just don't have local opportunities. So the fact that, you know, whether it's an Israeli opportunity, US opportunity, they like the fact that they now have access to it. But there is an insatiable demand around the world from an individual basis for Israeli companies. And so we're actually, we've hired people internally to work with Asia. We just hired a Mandarin-speaking woman who represents investor interests. And, you know, we're just finding like the fact that we can now talk the same language, that they can come to Israel and meet with the companies that OurCrowd itself is deploying money into. They're very excited about those opportunities.
So I would agree, and I would add, we have one of our strategic investors in our fund is a group called US Tech Global. Some of you might be familiar with them. It's primarily an Indian group based out of India, Southern California. And they're a multi-billion-dollar, kind of like a mini Tata consultancy type of firm. And we actually brought them over to Israel probably over the last year or two. And they're actually building out their first SOC, Security Operational Center. They're planning to hire like 10,000 Israelis to staff it. They said the talent pool that they saw out of Israel blew them away, and they, you know, signed this partnership with the Israeli government, and they're working on expanding it even further. We're working with them on trying to have this mission trip to Israel for a bunch of our CIOs and CMOs that they're participating on, probably in the fall, as one example. We are seeing so many of our companies out of the Israel market in the early days jumping over to Europe versus the US, because time zone, flight, Russia, I mean, it's like a 4-hour flight. They're going to Moscow. We have a number of our companies doing JVs in Russia, China, Japan. So more and more we're seeing different, you know, my partner just had meetings, my partner in Tel Aviv had meetings with British Telecom, British Airways, Sony, Fujitsu, Logica, a whole bunch of these, you know, groups that are really looking to find the most innovative technologies, and they're seeing a lot out of the Israel market. They're coming back regularly.
It's like every month, the multinationals are there scouting.
So yeah, I think that there's, again, I think we're just really scratching, you know, the surface here in terms of the possibilities. And I know we're getting calls all the time from regions all across the world to ask us how best to sort of enable that opportunity, to sort of have a kind of bi-directional flow of technology, innovation, and partnerships. So again, I think it'll be really interesting over the next 10 years.
Didn't answer your question?
Very good.
Question in the back?
How do you compare the Israeli market to other regional markets like Egypt and Turkey in terms of the number of startup, number of investments, technologies coming from these two countries specifically to the Israeli market?
I can't add a whole lot there.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Hard for me to comment too extensively. You know, we're not looking at a lot of stuff from Egypt or Turkey. Some other anecdotes, I would say, we've been looking at a handful of Israeli Palestinians that are starting really interesting companies, and they just had a really big exit. I think Patango had invested in an Israeli Palestinian team, and I forget, I think they were bought by Apple, I think, or Amazon, I think it was Amazon for $300-400 million, so it was some great success. And then we have some folks we've talked to in Turkey and been over there a little bit. It's been more, frankly, some of the high net worth, some of the largest families coming out of those regions that are interested in investing into some funds and getting access and exposure to the technology there. So it's been less about finding innovation, you know, from there. So we'll see some, but it's definitely not. And I know some friends of mine that have funds that are, you know, out of Israel that are cross-border trying to, you know, whether it's into, you know, Jordan, Egypt, you know, Turkey, in the region, and find opportunities. So I definitely think there will be more, and I think there's opportunity. You know, for us, like, you can't boil the ocean, so, you know, we even struggle with, you know, again, we're a relatively small fund, relatively small team. We're in the, you know, Silicon Valley, New York, Vancouver, you know, Israel, Germany. It's a lot. You know what I mean? So it's really all about focus, and I would say that I do expect some more of that, but I haven't seen a ton as of yet.
So we're also working quietly on some initiatives, Pan-Arabian initiatives, to create an OurCrowd-like structure for entrepreneurs and investors to create sort of that ecosystem as well. There are a lot of people out there who would like to see on both sides that happen, and so that's definitely something we're working on and monitoring. So going back to something you said before.
Let me just add one other point. I would say, like, my partner and I were over in Dubai a few years back, and you know, they were very much encouraging us to, like, open up an office there and be more dedicated. And for us you know, at that juncture, and even still today, it's just, again, it's like being an entrepreneur. I mean, you just have to focus. So it's prioritizing. You know, I absolutely think there's opportunity. It's just, you know, it's not on the top of our list. So we're you know, we haven't focused on it. I mean, and that being said, we're very receptive to international deal flow. So we see companies. I mean, we've seen companies from all over the world and across the U.S. and we're pretty flexible. We're less focused on where the technology comes from. We kind of don't care. We're investors. You know, we're fiduciaries to our limited partners. Our goal is to turn a $150 million fund into $1 billion. So if we see a company, I don't care if it's, you know, Lisbon, you know, Dubai, you know, Egypt or Turkey, or, you know, or Tokyo, for us, it's do we feel that we can help this company grow to become, you know, dominant in whatever their respective market is. But historically, you know, again, we've had some very deep experience within some of those markets where we feel very comfortable, and others not as much so. So I think we would, you know, need to find a local partner, or even, like, we've seen stuff out of Russia, for example, and, you know, we need local partners. You know, we're looking at stuff now in the Latin American markets that's you know, been rising up for the last couple of years. We still would want to co-invest with local partners, and, you know, and that's how we started out with Israel. You know, and still for the most part do, you know, like to co-invest with other local partners that can help us.
Another question. Is it a requirement from your point of view that the company that you invest in moves to the U.S.?
Absolutely not. Yeah, don't care. Again, for us, it's about world domination. So if we're convinced you can build the greatest company from any market that I've just, you know, any country, whatever region that I've touched on, you know, and typically in the Israel situation, you know, it's R&D in Israel, sales and marketing in the U.S. or Europe. So that's typically the evolution over time, but we don't really care. Other funds do, and we get into arguments about that, frankly. And again, it's another benefit we hopefully provide to the entrepreneurs, is being supportive to the entrepreneurs, because we have enough scar tissue. We've been, you know, investing for, you know, many decades at this point, that to me it's more, can you recruit the talent that you need to build a disruptive company and dominate your market? You know, so again, typically there's no market in Israel, so, you know, it's a lot of R&D. some folks will want you to close your R&D even and move that to Silicon Valley or wherever. You know, the venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, they don't even want to drive a car, they want to take a bike, you know, to the board meeting. And so, you know, my partners and I are on planes all the time. We're on calls at midnight and 7 a.m. with time differences, and it's challenging, but we view that as a little bit of a barrier to entry, and it's something we're prepared to do, and we think it's something you need to do, especially as an early stage investor, is really see comprehensively kind of what's going on in the marketplace, especially in certain categories. So there were times like we were looking like at certain areas around mobile security, and some of my peers on Sand Hill were like, oh, Bruce, we're looking at this mobile security company in the Valley. What do you think? Do you want to co-invest with us? And then some of my friends in New York are sending us a company in New York that's early, and then some of my friends in Israel, an Israeli company, and then someone out of Berlin. And for us, it's, you know, we're just looking at which is the best. And what I find interesting is a lot of the guys in the Valley may not even know about that Israeli company because they're not receptive to deal flow either at all or this early from Israeli companies or any other, you know, region for that matter. But because we're pretty much geographically agnostic, we'll oftentimes see many companies that are attacking, you know, respective market and maybe invest in none of them, or, you know, what obviously what we think is the most advanced and has the best opportunity to be a market leader. So.
Other questions?
I'm interested to know if you guys see any kind of trend in the Israeli companies and startups. You talked about cybersecurity, which
Yeah.
is a very big core of the Israeli business. But I wonder if over the years you see some kind of differences in the...
For sure. I mean, it really does, at least in my experience, and Zack can comment, there's like an ebb and flow sectorally of where we're seeing the deal flow come. And for a bunch of years, you know, kind of in, I don't know, I would say in the mid-2000s, I mean, going way, way back, you know, in the mid-90s, late 90s, early 2000, it was a lot of enterprise, business-to-business cybersecurity stuff coming out of, let's say, the Israel market. Then, you know, a lot of consumerization, social gaming hit, and then you saw a bunch of companies, you know, out of Israel that were trying to do consumer-based, you know, more B2C, more social gaming types of companies. You know, they're seeing, you know, the phenomenon of whether it's a Tencent and an Alibaba, and whether it's, you know, obviously Facebook and Twitter and Zynga and some of those types of folks. So trying that, and it was interesting. And the enterprise really like kind of went out of, you know, was not the flavor of the month for a period of time. So we would see much less. We've always kind of liked very boring, not sexy type of technology, like the real infrastructure. And if you kind of look back, you know, the metaphor I would use is like, who made money during the gold rush? You know, it was rare that people struck gold, but it was the Levi Strausses of the world. You know, it was, you know, the folks that were building the tents, you know, the canvas, the pots and pans and all those. That's kind of our philosophy on investing. It's not, you know, necessarily pretty and sexy and on the cover. And, you know, I joke with my friends, they almost don't know any of the companies that we've invested in, but they're amazing companies, and they're, you know, building, you know, disruptive technology that oftentimes, more often than not, will get acquired, you know, by some of the obvious players in the ecosystem. I think for sure, you know, and I don't know if our exit with like Cyvera, for example, was a little bit of a catalyst, but definitely, you know, part of it. There's been a shift back in my sense towards like enterprise cybersecurity has been very, very hot, and, you know, potentially even, you know, too hot, and overfunded, and so there's, you know, it's trying to filter through the noise to find the signal of, you know, where there's opportunities. So we've seen these cycles, and, you know, I mean, it was like, I remember in the US market, we were looking at like hundreds of Groupon types of clones. You know what I mean? It was like, or like if some of you are old enough to remember like the whole B2B exchanges, I mean, that went from like 2,500 different exchanges to 0, you know what I mean, in the span of a few months. And I remember, like one of the most prominent B2B exchanges.
Ariba.
Which one?
Ariba?
It wasn't Ariba. I mean, that was actually reasonably, you know, not bad. But there was another one that was on like a panel with like Charlie Rose or something like that back in like 1999 with like the CEO of like DuPont or something like that. And he was like, "You're not gonna be here, DuPont," in like 5 years. And like literally like 3 months later, they were gone. You know, not DuPont. You know what I mean? So it's like, you know, we try to, you know, be aware, and it's hard when there's a frothy, you know, sentiment in the marketplace. we try not to play jump ball and really, we typically don't pay up, on investment, pricing and stuff like that. And so you might lose things and, it's okay, I guess, and you have to make those decisions. But-
So we're seeing very similar, I would say our two strongest like subsectors are cybersecurity and medical technology, like devices. One company that we co-invested in called BioCatch actually. So you have like two-factor authentication for your phone. So you're giving a password on one thing, you're getting sort of sent to another place so it can identify who you are at the moment that you log in. So BioCatch kind of took a completely novel way of doing it and actually continuously authenticates you given your behavior. The system learns like how you log in, whether you do Control-C, Control-V, whether you're a right clicker, and it plays little cognitive games with you
And they do
to assure that you're the
invisible
guy.
challenges, basically.
Yeah, they'll hide your mouse. And like there's 18 different ways people restart their mouse. Some people move side to side. So it's taking these sort of novel approaches to to problems and finding maybe a cross-disciplinary solution to it. We're also seeing again those scenarios that Bruce described, guys who came out of B2B or came out of enterprise and are kind of going after the consumer market at this point. Sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't make sense, but cybersecurity and medtech are by far our most exciting parts of our portfolio.
And I would definitely say the feedback we're getting from folks also like on the digital media side, ad tech side of things, it's been challenging and folks are not.
Can't even call it ad tech anymore.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Can't call it ad tech.
What would you want to call it?
Funnel optimization.
Funnel optimization. All right. I didn't get that email. I think it went into my.
You're not on that memo.
Exactly. So we have a number of companies that are doing really well in this space that will continue to do well, but I think in terms of like an IPO, that's probably challenging, and we always probably one of our greatest risks when we invest in a company is capitalization risk. So it's thinking through, okay, we're seed investors, but who's going to come in and support this company if they need 25 million or 50 million more on subsequent rounds of funding? How's that going to happen? And so I think a lot of the folks in the venture community are challenged and again have a question around like, hey, can this be a standalone? And what's nice though is again, like for us as a seed fund, we don't even need an IPO market. Cyvera, the security company out of Israel, we seeded them. It was a 20x in 16 months. Like, I'll take that every day of the week at the end of the day. You know what I mean? And like, but the problem is, again, and mea culpa on behalf of the venture capital community, but really, most of the venture funds are broken. And that's sort of the shift that happened on the venture side over the past 10 or 15 years, is that the funds went from, Sequoia's first fund was $5 million. And then they had like, there were no funds that were north of 100 million or 150 million, going back to the Netscape IPO in the mid-90s. And then all of these funds now are billion-dollar funds. And it's become really a function of, for them, management fee. And they're taking home millions of dollars every year, whether they're successful or not. And for us, if you do the math on, $150 million fund or a $200 million fund, we do okay, in terms of our, lifestyle, but it's not at all. Stepping back, it's alignment of interest, to my mind, is one of the biggest macro themes that's important for you as an entrepreneur, for me as an investor, and then for my investor pool. So there's alignment of interest throughout that whole food chain. We are aligned with you, the entrepreneurs, because we're getting it on the ground floor. If you're successful, we're successful. And then our limited partners know that we don't really make much money on our small funds, and we've intentionally stayed small and early. It's all about taking a $100 million fund or a $200 million fund and getting 3, 4, 5, 6x return on that fund. Then we make a lot of money, as do our investors, and everyone should be happy. And so I think that alignment of interest has really broken to a certain degree when some of these funds are billion-plus funds, and they've really taken the venture out of venture capital. They're crossover funds, they're late-stage funds, but many of these funds just really don't do early-stage investing, and that's what many of you probably are looking for. And I think it's challenging in the Israel market, and it's absolutely also challenging in Silicon Valley.